Okay.
Couldn't phrase that?
Yeah, maybe if we just at least this one, just to lower something. Yeah. Okay, so we're hoping to make a start, inshallah, for our second session. But before I do that, I was just kind of hoping to recap, because we have introduced quite a few concepts all at once, and it'd be good to know if anyone maybe needs to have anything explained again or elaborated upon. Is everyone sort of okay? Nilly, is everything that we've gone through understandable so far? Or?
For me it is,
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
No, because we came half through.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Actually, the recording will be available to watch on Facebook or whatever again, so you can watch what you missed. But I just want to give a quick summary of sort of what we've gone through so far. We've spoken about the fact that there are two ways to prove the existence of Allah. Okay, in a broad sense. I mean, there are more than two ways, but in a very broad sense, there are two kind of categories of argument. One of them being deductive arguments. Now, these kind of refer to logical arguments that you can do without recourse to scientific experimentation, right? The second type of argument is an inductive argument, and this is also referred to as the scientific method, and it's also the Quran's method and the Risale-i-Nur's method of proving the existence of Allah, and that's the method of like looking at things in the universe and saying, hey, look, this thing has to have a maker. Now, the main difference between the two arguments is that the deductive argument offers, if it's valid and sound, it offers complete certainty of its truth. Okay? Whereas the inductive argument, it can still offer a very high probability of its truth, but there always remains at least a logical possibility that it still might one day not be true or might not be true now. Okay, so that's the distinction between the two. We also mentioned that just because deductive arguments have got that kind of complete certainty of their veracity, that they're better arguments. Okay, they're not necessarily better arguments. An argument is said to be a good one if it can convince. Now, if people cannot understand a certain deductive argument, because these are logical arguments that, well, at the very least, they require some level of intelligence, So maybe not everyone all the time can understand all the deductive arguments. So that if they were to be relied upon alone, many people might not be able to obtain faith, okay? So the preferred method is the method that can convince more easily and better, that method being the inductive method, okay? So we went through all that, but we said that nonetheless, Bediüzzaman Said Nursi still sees it fit that two deductive arguments be included in Ayat al-Kubra, in the Risale-i-Nur, okay? And he actually designates them as first truths, okay? They're a first truth. So he sees these as worthy of being mentioned first, but nonetheless relegates them to being merely corroborators, okay? They corroborate the testimony of the Kitab al-Kainat, okay? The testimony of the Book of the Universe, all the things in the universe, all the things that can be shown scientifically. Okay, so these logical arguments, although they can offer greater certainty of their truth, are merely corroborators. Okay, we mention in particular the Kalam cosmological arguments, or the argument from the temporality of the universe. It's got various names. It's championed in the modern era by William Lane Craig. Okay. The famous Christian philosopher, but it has its roots in the Mutakallimun of medieval Islam, okay? In particular, Imam Ghazali. Right? That argument is that we can show that the world is a temporal world, okay? And we can show that the world cannot have existed forever, therefore it must have had a beginning. So the argument goes, whatever begins to exist has a cause for its existence. The universe began to exist. Therefore, the conclusion, the universe requires a cause for its existence. Okay? So that's as far as the argument goes. Now, you and I would say immediately, well, that cause must be Allah. immediately the atheist will say, well, you haven't proven yet who the cause is, okay? They will rely on that. But it doesn't matter because we're going to well and truly demonstrate that the cause cannot be what they're saying. It's got to be something like what we're saying, okay? Our second argument, our second deductive argument is the argument from contingency, okay? And I've got a quote here from Ayat al-Kubra in the Risale-i-Nur. Ustad says, if there is no cause to be found in the essence of a thing, either for its being or for its non-being, so that these two are equally possible, that thing cannot be necessary and eternal. Okay? All that means is that take any given thing, okay? Now, you can ask yourself whether that thing exists as a necessity of its own nature. Does it have to exist? Okay? That's the question. So that's kind of what the argument rests on, you know, the distinction between things that are contingent, okay, that rely on something else to exist, that don't have to exist, and indeed maybe once didn't exist, as opposed to things that exist necessarily, that those things whose existence is impossible, okay? So those are the two concepts that we're going to go through, and we're going to delve more deeply into this particular argument from Mr. Okay? So he goes on and says, hence the existence of a necessary existence becomes necessary, whose like cannot exist, whose similitude is impossible, all other than whom is contingent and created by him. Okay? So don't get hung up on that because it's a little bit difficult to understand, especially from the English translation, but we're going to dissect it in a simpler form, inshallah. Okay, so that argument from contingency was actually has its roots in a famous Islamic or two famous Muslim philosophers from medieval times, Al-Farabi and Ibn Sina, okay, who in the Western world is known as Avicenna. Okay, but these guys are very famous in philosophical circles, and they propounded these arguments, but we can be assured of its veracity because Imam Ghazali gave it the seal of approval, and now Bediüzzaman Said Nursi gives it the seal of approval. Because there are a lot of philosophical arguments from the Muslim philosophers for the existence of God, but not all of them are approved by, you know, Zats such as Imam Ghazali and Ustad. Okay, so the fact that these two arguments appear in the Risale-i-Nur and appear in the writings of Imam Ghazali is a very good indication of their veracity. Okay, so as we said a moment ago, everything which exists in the universe or not in the universe, right? We're not just talking about in the universe now. Anything that exists in any realm can be either contingent or necessary. Okay, there's no in between. Now, if they are contingent, they rely upon some other for their existence. Okay? Now, for example, I am contingent. You know, I didn't have to exist, right? If my mum and dad didn't meet and get married, I might not have existed, okay? Or I might have existed in a slightly different form, right? So you can see that I, for one, am not necessary. I am contingent, right? A necessary thing is that which its existence, its non-existence, sorry, I'm getting tongue-tied, its non-existence is impossible. But that's not the case for me. I could have easily not existed simply by my parents not getting married, right? Anything which once didn't exist, right? If something once upon a time didn't exist, immediately, right, there is proof of the fact that it's not necessary. So finite things cannot be necessary, right? When we look at all things in the universe, we see that they're all actually contingent, right? Everything is contingent. Anything that's changing in its essence, all right? Anything that changes in essence, anything which is finite, anything which once didn't exist, anything which when you study its nature, you cannot find any reason to say that it exists necessarily. All these things are contingent, okay? So that's just a broad definition of what it is. Now, contingent things cannot explain other contingent things, right? Similar to our car crash, well, exactly like our car crash example from before the break, contingent things cannot adequately explain other contingent things. That being the case, evolution could not adequately explain why it is that there is life, or why life exists in this form. Cannot adequately explain it. Even if evolution, for example, is true, right, it would rely upon some, law of the universe, wouldn't it? Okay. Now, none of those laws exist necessarily, because actually cosmologically we can prove that the laws of the universe didn't even exist until a short time after the Big Bang. Right? They haven't always existed. Now, space, again, is not necessary. Space is expanding. So if you go back in time, it was contracting. It contracts. And there was indeed a time when even space didn't exist. And there was indeed a time when matter didn't exist. Okay? All of these things can be proven either through our earlier arguments in relation to the impossibility of actual infinite, or through recent cosmology. They can all be proven to be finite things. Something that's finite cannot be said to be necessary. All right? Now, since no contingent thing can adequately explain other contingent things, and since an endless chain of contingent causes is again absurd, a necessary existent becomes necessary, that requires nothing but itself to exist. So, I don't know if I've been as clear as with the last argument. I mean, this one is a little bit more difficult to understand because it requires an understanding of the concepts of necessary and contingency, right? Necessity and contingency. So it might be an opportune time now to ask, is everybody clear on the difference between necessary and contingent?
Am I right to come to the conclusion that if everything is contingent, then obviously I only read one thing that's necessary, and it's Allah.
You've got a good point. Some thinkers have suggested that there are some other things that exist necessarily, such as numbers. Okay? Certainly the number one, they will argue. The number one, or the concept of one, they'll say that exists necessarily, All right? It exists, but it's an abstract thing, isn't it? It's an abstract thing.
But it only exists for contingent beings like us, for us to understand that Allah is one.
Yeah, I mean, that could be true. But what they're saying is that, and I'm not going, I haven't actually looked at the reasoning behind it, but look, it seems to make sense. I can see where they're coming from when they say that something like a number might exist necessarily, but it doesn't matter for the purposes of our argument, because a number is merely an abstract thing.
Again, isn't this all physical? I mean, because if we talk about non-physical things, there are going to be many other things that are necessary.
Possibly. What I'll say is that even the abstract things like numbers, my initial thoughts are that even abstract things which might seem to exist necessarily, again, they only exist because of Allah's existence. Okay? So they don't, Allah, you're right, Badish, when I can see where your train of thought is going. You're right when you see that the only thing that exists necessarily is Allah. There's nothing else, really. Things like numbers, even they exist, although they might exist concomitantly with Allah, nonetheless, they don't exist apart from Allah. They wouldn't exist if there was no such thing as Allah. There'd be no such thing as a number, right? That's kind of how I see it, but it doesn't matter. For the purposes of our argument, it doesn't matter, because what we're trying to illustrate here...
You do need to keep it physical, I think. For example, isn't compassion necessary? Mm-hmm. Isn't life necessary?
But
prior to all of this,
what I'll say is that if Wajib al-Wujud didn't exist, if Allah didn't exist, let's just pretend for a moment.
Can you differentiate those things from that Wajib al-Wujud?
The reason why they're necessary, if they are necessary, the only reason why they're necessary is because they are actually part of Allah's essence.
That's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, but because we're equivocating here, right? When we're talking about, when we say things like mercy, the atheist will say no, not mercy as Allah's essence, but mercy as in in the physical sense, in the sense of human interaction, in the sense of human social relationships, right? I'm not talking about that.
That's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
The argument should be kept on a physical sense.
Yeah.
Because that's what the question's coming from anyway.
Phone just keeps ringing. They'll say that the only things that, like, they're not talking, when the philosophers talk about the difference between necessary and contingent, they're not differentiating between, Allah's essence and, they're not making that distinction. Okay, we can make that distinction. We can see that these things can exist necessarily because of Allah's existence, because they are part of His essence, but they're not talking about it in respect of that. They're talking about it, like when they talk about a number, for example, they'll say that maybe a number exists in its own right, even if there was no such thing as God, right? Even if there was no such thing as God, they're suggesting that maybe things such as, a number, certainly number one at least, might exist necessarily. Now, I'll say that the number one only exists because it's part of Allah's essence, because Allah is Ahad and Wahid. Allah is Wahid, so therefore the number one, the concept of oneness exists necessarily. Yes, that's true, But we're actually digressing, because for the purposes of our argument, we're only talking about things such as, the things that we know, like time, space, matter, right? All of these kinds of things. None of them exist necessarily. They're all contingent. All of them once didn't exist, okay, and came into existence later. So obviously not necessary, because if something is necessary, well then it would have always existed, right? So that's the key distinction. The key distinction is that something is necessary as opposed to contingent if its non-existence is impossible, and something is contingent, right, if it may not exist or once did not exist, if it's finite, if it's transitory, right, if it's changing in terms of its essence, right, not in terms of its actions, because Allah acts as well, and that doesn't mean that His essence changes, right? So, getting back to the argument, here's the argument, right? In this universe, there are only contingent things, right? There are only contingent things. Therefore, the thing which exists necessarily has to be something that is not time, that is not space, and that is not matter. It has to be something totally different, right? And that necessary existent has to exist, because otherwise these contingent things would not exist. Do you see the crux of the argument? There are contingent things. They can't explain themselves. There can't be an infinite chain of explanations. Has to stop somewhere, right? So, therefore, the necessary existent, the wajib al-wujud, becomes necessary, all right? The necessary existent becomes necessary. Isn't it funny? It's a tautology. Now, okay, so now, getting back to our argument, it's simply the fact that all things in the universe are contingent. Contingent things cannot explain their own existence or their form, mind you. They can't even explain the way they are. Not merely the fact that they exist, they can't even explain the way they are. As opposed to necessary things which exist as a necessity of their own nature, their non-existence being impossible. Okay? Now, time, space and matter all exist contingently. Okay, the only things that may be defined as necessary are a being like Allah, like God, or possibly abstract things like numbers. Okay, we've already been through that. Okay, as the philosopher which I mentioned earlier, as he would say, numbers don't have the ability to create anything. Okay, so that leaves us with nothing, no alternative other than Allah, other than a being like God, to explain the existence of these contingent things, right? So just to recap, you've got contingent things in the universe. Everything in the universe is contingent, including the universe itself as a whole. It is contingent. It once didn't exist. This is supported by scientific evidence as well. It is supported by our previous arguments as well, okay? That the universe is contingent, it's finite, okay? Since that's the case, the necessary existent is required. Who's a candidate for being the necessary existent? Well, there are only two sorts of things that we know of that could be a necessary existent. Okay, that's something like what the books of religion define as a god. Okay, or possibly something like a number. Now, as soon as they're a number, doesn't have any creative ability. It's merely an abstract thing. You only have Allah left as an alternative. So that's the end of that argument, right? Can anyone think what might the atheist here assert? What might the atheist say now? Because what have we proved so far, right? I'll come back to you in a second, Barry. What have we shown so far throughout tonight? We've proven that the universe cannot be infinite, it must be finite. Okay? If it's finite, it's also contingent. So it requires the necessary existent because of its contingency, its contingentness. Because of its finiteness, it once didn't exist, therefore it required a creator to create it. So we've proven all these things deductively, okay, with complete certainty. What might the atheist still say here?
I believe that this clearly demonstrates that it's a very difficult argument for the atheist. It becomes
they're in a bit of a spot of bother.
It is a spot of bother because it's all based on what you've mentioned is based on what we know. It's logical and scientific. Everything is transient. It has a beginning and an end. And based on the contingent argument, it's very clear that there has to be a supreme being. There has to be.
Okay. Yep. Like I was saying during the break, the strength of an argument is often borne out through the weakness of its, attempts at refutation, right? Through the weakness of its alternatives. Okay. What they will try to say in relation to these arguments is simply that you've proven that there has to be a creator, possibly, they'll say. You've proven there has to be a creator. You've proven that there has to be a necessary existence, something that exists necessarily. You've proven that. You have not proven that that thing must be your God. You have not proven that that thing must be a living, thinking, sentient being. You have not proven any of this. Okay? Why can't... They'll honestly make this allegation, right? They'll say, why can't the cause of the universe, for example, going back to our argument from Huduf, from change and temporality. Why can't the cause for the universe's existence, why can't it be some set of mechanically operating, lifeless, forces, like something like a machine. Think of something like a machine, yet an immaterial machine, right? Like, because haven't you got things like, you've got forces of nature, even in this universe, you've got laws of physics and you've got things like that. You've got things like gravity.
You've just proven that they're all contingent.
They will actually try to say that, yes, you might have proven that those things are contingent, but they're saying that outside of the universe, or prior to the universe, right, before the creation of the universe, why couldn't there be something immaterial, lifeless, just a set of mechanically operating, necessary and sufficient conditions to cause the universe?
Then you go back to your initial comment about the probability. What are you going to believe? That something that only has a 1% as opposed to a 99%?
Yeah, I like your thinking. It's good, You're right. Immediately, one sounds much more likely to be true than the other, right? But actually, we don't need to rely on that. We don't need to rely only on that because, again, they'll say, well, you've just given me an inductive argument with a probability of truth. There's still the logical possibility that you're wrong, won't they? What we're seeing here is that actually, atheism does rely largely on faith, It is a massive leap of faith given the current state of affairs, and the current cosmological evidence as well. It's a massive leap of faith to say that atheism is true. In fact, most atheists will say, I'm an agnostic. They'll say, no, I'm not saying that I can prove that God doesn't exist. All I'm saying is that there isn't enough information to know for sure, Yeah. So the problem for the agnostic and the atheist is that, again, we can prove, right, probably deductively too, you know, that the cause of the universe and the necessary existent has to possess the attribute of will. Irade, okay? Irade, will. Has to possess that. And the proof for this is implicit in the two arguments that we've just discussed, okay? So, as follows. The necessary existent must possess will, okay? Now, immediately, right, will, what kind of a thing can have will? A living thing, right? You know, so they'll try to avoid admitting this. They will try to avoid it because it will mean a living cause of the universe. They don't want that. If we can prove that the universe has got a cause, they'll prefer that it's something non-living, okay, for various reasons. They don't want to believe in God. But, okay, here's the thing, right? The impossibility of an actual infinite, as we discussed earlier, precludes the infinitude of time, okay? So there cannot be an infinite amount of past time. Not in this universe, not outside of it. It's just impossible. There cannot be an infinite amount of past time, okay? This is the position of Imam Ghazali, okay, as well. Now, therefore, the cause of the universe's existence must be something that exists timelessly. So immediately, we're one by one, we're fulfilling the criterion for the definition of Allah in the Quran, aren't we? We know Allah to be timeless, don't we? You know, Allah creates time. Allah is not subject to time. Allah does not live in time. Allah is timeless. Time is a creation for our benefit, you know. But anyway, I'm digressing. But again, what I'm proving is that there cannot be an infinite amount of time, right? Isn't that true? Because there cannot be an actual infinite, right? So time, as a concept, cannot, or the discrete intervals of time must be finite in number, okay? Even if there are a multitude of different universes, still, altogether, they must have only existed for a finite period of time, right? So, therefore, the cause of the universe's existence must be something that exists timelessly, okay? If it's subject to time, then it must be finite and therefore itself require explanation, okay? So, it has to be timeless. That's the first thing. Now, if the cause of the universe's existence is something lifeless and deterministic, like some sort of machine that possesses no will, but yet it exists timelessly, then why did the universe have a beginning? Okay. Now, the argument goes like this, right? The atheist, the same atheist that was speaking a moment ago, he will say, right, there's at least a logical possibility that prior to this universe's creation, you know, here you've got like a machine-like entity, you know. It's not living. When we say machine, we're not talking about necessarily a machine made out of matter. Maybe they assert that, I don't know. But they're talking more like a machine in terms of it's not alive. It doesn't make decisions, you know. It just, you know, automatically does things, right? Now, that machine cannot be temporal. It has to be timeless, doesn't it? Okay? So, like, think of like a still lump of, you know, matter, right? It's not moving, no events are occurring, it's just existing timelessly, right? Think of that. Now, if that thing were the cause of the universe's existence, really the universe should not have had a beginning, the universe should have existed eternally. Okay? Because here's this thing that they're positing, right? They're saying that your arguments do not refute the notion that this machine exists, right? But we've just shown that that machine would have to exist timelessly. No one's denying that. It's not even controversial. It would have to exist timelessly because time is finite, you know. Now, if the machine is subject to time, then the machine itself is finite. And then we'll have to ask, well, what caused that machine? And there can't be an infinite series of machines. It has to stop somewhere. So they're saying, yeah, okay, so there is a necessarily existing first machine, you know, and it is the cause of the universe. We'll immediately say that if that thing is that mechanical thing, if that is the cause of the universe, then why is it that the universe didn't coexist with that thing eternally? You know, the only way to get out of this conundrum, the only way to get out of it is to say that whatever caused the universe, although it exists timelessly, it possesses the faculty of will, the ability to make a decision, to choose to create something in a particular form, okay, and to create it in finite form at a particular point, okay? So therefore, we prove, this is called the principle of determination, okay, from Imam Ghazali. Okay, so they can prove that whatever created this universe has to possess will, okay, from one respect, and also from a second respect too. Okay, just going on from that earlier point, the same philosopher, William Craig, he says, why does a universe with a beginning exist rather than an eternal universe with no beginning? How can an effect with a beginning originate from a changeless permanent cause? He's talking about the machine here, right? He's refuting the philosophers. He says, that's the real head scratcher. I think Al-Ghazali and those medieval Muslim theologians were dead on concerning this argument for a free agent as the cause of the universe. So, again, the only way a temporal world could be created by an eternal or timeless cause would be if it possesses will. So as to freely choose to create a universe with a beginning. But that's the crux of the argument, okay? That point there. Is anyone stuck on that, or is that in any way not make sense? Funnily enough, in Islam, we know that Allah possesses the attribute of kulli iradeh, absolute free will, okay? Okay, now the second respect. Not only are contingent things unable to explain their existence, they're also unable to explain their form or nature. Okay? Does anyone need me to explain that? I mean, is that kind of self-explanatory, or it's kind of like this, right? Remember I said that, you know, here's thing A and thing B. Now, it's suggested, if it were to be suggested that thing A, let's say this book, okay? Why is this book red and why does it have 600 pages, you know? Well, it's because the thing that made it, being this person, okay, me, this person painted it red and gave it 600 pages, okay? Now, in reality, has that really explained why that book has got that many pages or that many colours? It has not. Because why? Because I too require explanation. Okay, I don't exist necessarily, right? In order to really explain why this book exists and why it has a certain form, a certain number of pages, or a certain colour, okay? To really explain that, think about it. I mean, you need to be able to explain a lot of things. Well, you know, first of all, well, it's red because the thing that created it, or the thing that made it, is a living thing with a brain and intelligence and the ability to make choices, right? And that's why it's red. But that doesn't explain everything, because why does that living being exist? Why does he exist? Does he exist as a necessity of his own nature? No, he doesn't, because he wants to exist either. So why does he exist? Because his mum and dad got married and, you know, and they had a baby, right? Does that explain it? No, it still doesn't explain it. So actually, nothing in the universe can adequately explain anything else when you think about it like that, right? Nothing can adequately explain not just the existence of other things, but the form of other things. And look, I don't think my example has been too good, but you can kind of, you know, you can kind of get a feel for it, you know, that when you think about it at length, nothing in the universe can adequately explain the form of anything else, right? That's the first point.
Do you think that we just accept those explanations because we're superficial as human beings, and we're content for an answer like, well, the author wrote 600 pages and he decided that it's going to be a red cover on it. And we don't look any deeper into it normally. I mean, it requires a deeper thought process to understand what you're saying.
You're dead on, and I'll give a real world example of it, right? Again, the theory of evolution, right? Evolution is said to explain adequately why biodiversity, right? Why are there so many living organisms and why are they the way they are, okay? Evolution claims to be able to explain this, right? But like I said earlier, it can never provide a full explanation, even if let's assume that it's true. Let's assume that they are completely right about how evolution works. Can it adequately explain it? You know, it can't. It can't, because evolution can only exist because of some pre-existing laws, and those pre-existing laws can only exist because the universe exists in the first place, and the universe existing in the first place can only be explained by reference to Allah. Okay, so, but people don't want to scratch beneath the surface, right? People merely want to look at things, you know, at a very superficial level, like you say, you know. So what I'm trying to illustrate is that not only can things in the universe not explain the existence of other things adequately, they also cannot explain the form of those things adequately. Okay, so they go hand in hand. So all things self-evidently have a particular form or essence. Who or what determines, out of the innumerable possibilities, that particular form? Other contingent things cannot be the true cause of the existence of form of other things, since they too are created. Their form too is determined by something else. Okay? Again, a necessary existent who has the ability to choose that form from among countless choices becomes absolutely necessary. Okay? So I think it's self-explanatory. You know, I think it's quite easy to see that the necessary existent has to possess the attribute of will, has to be able to make a choice, because there are almost infinite choices. There are innumerable choices as to how a given thing can be. Anything. Whether it's an atom and its properties, or whether it's the DNA of a human being, or, you know, anything whatsoever. Okay? It could have been an innumerable different number of ways. Its form could have been slightly different in a million different ways, you know. So its form cannot be adequately explained by other phenomena in the universe. Okay? It can only be explained by reference to a necessarily existing thing that is other than the universe. Okay? Because nothing in the universe exists necessarily. Okay? Therefore, it has to possess will. Okay? It can't be this machine that they posit. You know? It cannot be something mechanical, because mechanical machine-like things don't have the ability to make choices. They are not alive to possess will to make choices. Okay. Now, Ustad speaks about this at length, and I'm going to conclude with the relevant part from Ayat al-Kubra, or a piece of it anyway, where he says, as for contingence, it prevails over and surrounds all of the cosmos. For we see that all things, universal or particular, big or small, from the atom to the planet, all are sent to the world with a particular essence, a specific form, a distinct identity, particular attributes, wise qualities, and beneficial organs. Now, to bestow on that particular essence and quiddity its peculiarities from amongst the infinite possibilities available, to clothe it in its specific, distinctive, and appropriate form from among the possibilities and probabilities that are as numerous as the forms that may be conceived. All of these are indications, proofs and affirmations to the number of innumerable possibilities of the necessary existence, infinite power, and unlimited wisdom of the necessary existence, who creates, chooses, specifies, and distinguishes the quiddity and identity, the form and shape, the attribute and situation of all contingent beings. Okay. Any questions about that? Is it clear? Or
Yeah, it's very clear.
yeah. So what have we achieved tonight? I think we've proven beyond a shadow of a doubt that such a thing as Allah, such a being as Allah, has to exist by virtue of the fact that we exist, by virtue of the fact that the universe exists. We cannot explain ourselves. The universe can't explain itself. The necessary existence of Wajibul Wujud becomes necessary. Okay, and I'll finish on that note.